Worst People Iceberg. Today we'll be taking a look into the worst people in history. As the user who posted this iceberg explains, I should clarify that this chart is ranked by how much power and influence these people had, not by how bad they are. Most well-known and influential people at the top, least powerful and most obscure people are at the bottom. If you enjoyed today's content, be sure to scroll down and click that like button for me, and if you're feeling really generous, you can go to the right and click the red subscribe button. It's free. Alright, let's get right into it. Adolf Hitler, widely considered to be one of the worst human beings in modern history. The leader of the Nazi Party believed the Jewish and Marxists betrayed the German army during World War I. His experience in the war, along with his resentment, was the foundation of his political agenda going forward, most notably resulting in the Holocaust, dubbing the Jewish population as the enemy of Germany, leading to political changes that resulted in the death of nearly 11 million non-combatants during World War II. More than half of these were European Jews. Hitler's dictatorship over Nazi Germany has had lasting effects on the world since the end of the Second World War. Joseph Stalin. Following the fall of the Russian Empire, Stalin went to any means necessary to become leader of the Soviet Union. Here, Joseph put into motion his master plan of industrializing his country into 3 5-year plans. Things sounded great for the citizens of the Soviet Union. New jobs, new culture, and most of all, new leadership. Nothing could go wrong until it did. You see, there was a price to pay if you didn't meet your deadlines for the work that was assigned to you. In addition, Stalin's grand plan came to a halt in 1941 when Adolf Hitler broke the peace treaty by invading the Soviet Union. The Nazi forces invaded from the Western Front with relative ease. The tide of war shifted at the Battle of Stalingrad when the Soviet army had its first major victory of the war. They carried this momentum until the Nazi army surrendered in 1945. Immediately following the war, animosity between the Soviets and the Americans sprang forward. Stalin felt betrayed by Truman. When America unleashed the sun onto Japan, they saw no use for Stalin or the Soviets, as they saw them as far inferior to them. Soon after, the Cold War arose between the United States and the Soviet Union, further crippling the Soviet economy until Stalin's death in 1953. Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, is famed for being one of the most influential leaders in Russian history behind Lenin and his lasting effects. Through strategic negotiations, he gained total impunity for all of his actions, leading to sackings of Novigrad and surrounding cities where he killed indiscriminately. The main motivation behind this was his own paranoia and the thought that there was a plot against him. He is also the same man who beat his own son to death, and beat his daughter-in-law so badly that she miscarried. So yeah, Ivan was pretty terrible. Pol Pot. Pot had a vision for Cambodia and wished to bring his country back to being full of strong labor. In order to achieve this, Pot eliminated virtually all of Cambodia's educated working class. Doctors, teachers, and salesmen were all subject to being stripped of their prior employment and education and forced to work in the fields of Cambodia. Those who didn't comply were met with 2 choices. The first is being taken to a detention center where government officials use special persuasion to get them to comply. The second option is death. The brutality of the interrogation methods cannot be understated. It went as far as there being an official torture manual used by guards of the detention centers. For those who didn't comply with the new government reform, there were not a lot of freedoms bestowed onto them. Any form of private property or religious practice had to be relinquished. If you did not comply, detention center. This is just scratching the surface of the totalitarian rule imposed by Pot. Genghis Khan. Temujin, otherwise known as Genghis Khan, is widely known for building and maintaining the largest empire in history. So large and so successful that he conquered more land in 20 years than Rome could in 400 years. His rise to power started in a civil war in Mongolia. He believed in strength in numbers and wished to expand his army. The only issue is that there was another Mongolian tribe led by Jamukha did not want to join. This led to a lengthy civil war between the two men until Jamukha's final defeat. Shortly after gaining complete control over Mongolia, Genghis Khan quickly began moving to expand Mongolia's borders, setting his sights on modern-day Beijing. At the time, this was one of the most advanced cities in the world. Through a lengthy campaign, the Mongolian Empire captured the city. Something that is important to understand about Temujin's campaign is that he is famed for taking the most beautiful women from the cities and tribes he raided. As for men, they were usually either killed during the battles or forced into his army. Through brute strength, Temujin's army moved throughout most of Asia and Europe. The Mongolian Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean through most of Asia, equivalent to the land size of Africa. Temujin's cruelty in his conquest should be acknowledged. His armies brutalized Asia and Europe. This is where I believe if you aren't with me, you're against me mentality is best shined on. For those who were not with Temujin, suffered horribly, including being boiled alive. Kim Il-sung, the first president of North Korea and is seen as the father of North Korea. Sung spent most of his youth and adolescence studying communism. His family immigrated from Japan early in his life due to the brutality of the Japanese government at the time towards Korea. One day, while fooling around with some explosive, he caused an explosion on the train track. This caused a line of events that led to Japan invading China. Sung fled to the Soviet Union, where he served as a general in the Second World War. At the conclusion of the war, the Soviet Union granted Kim to be leader of the Korean Communist Party of North Korea. As leader, he had a no-tolerance policy, imprisoning and killing any North Korean citizens who opposed him as supreme leader. He also thought it would be a great idea to invade South Korea. However, at the end of the Korean War, Kim Kim had about the same amount of land as he did when he started the war, leading to millions of Korean citizens' deaths completely in vain. Saddam Hussein. Saddam was the 5th dictator of Iraq and is infamous for the lengths he went to in order to maintain power over Iraq. However, many Iraqi citizens did not agree with Saddam being the dictator, forming a group named the Shia Rebels. In July 1982, an assassination attempt was carried out against Saddam where he visited the Dajil. It failed, leading to Saddam ordering a mass killing of the residents of Dajil who took part in the assassination attempt. It's been reported that over 140 people died in this massacre, some who didn't even have anything to do with it. This was one of the long list of crimes against humanity Saddam committed until his death in December of 2006. Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini was the first supreme leader of Iran, and virtually every negative thing you've ever heard about Iran leads back to this man. Khomeini popularized the term the Great Satan, the Wounded Snake when referring to America, and if you couldn't tell by the name, he really did not like America. Following the Iranian Revolution, Khomeini enacted many reforms that limited women's rights, there were no minority religions, and land ownership was prohibited. This led to a lot of change in Iran. During his presidency, a group of Iranian students displayed a violent protest where they stormed the U.S. Embassy and took 63 Americans hostage. Originally, Khomeini didn't even bother to even recognize this was even going on. He actually ignored it for a while until one of his advisors had proposed to him that he could use this event as a way to bargain for his financial assets in America, which also, if you didn't know, we are not allowed to officially trade with Iran, and it's been like that for a long time. However, this did not work, and it actually kind of pissed off Ronald Reagan. He imposed heavier trade embargoes on Iran and filed a lawsuit with the International Court of Justice. From Khomeini's original role in the Iranian Revolution, through the Iran-Iraq War, and to the civilians who lived under him, about 500,000 people died. The exact number is up to debate as Iran saturates this number for propaganda purposes. Shiro Ishii. Ishii was a Japanese military officer and a physician who led Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II. Ishii is infamous for his involvement in numerous war crimes, including human experimentation and biological warfare. Under Ishii's leadership, Unit 731 conducted gruesome experiments on thousands of innocent civilians, including men, women, and children, and prisoners of war, in Chinese and other Asian territories occupied by Japan during the war. These experiments involved infecting victims with deadly diseases such as anthrax, bubonic plague, and cholera, and conducting vivisection, freezing, and drowning tests and other forms of torture to study the effects of these diseases and conditions on the human body. Ishii's actions were part of Japan's aggressive military expansion in pursuit of biological and chemical warfare capabilities during World War II. The atrocities committed by Unit 731 resulted in the suffering and death of an estimated 250,000 people, although the exact number is difficult to determine due to the secrecy surrounding the unit's activities. After Japan's defeat in 1945, Ishii was granted immunity for his war crimes by the United States in exchange for sharing his research findings. He later went on to pursue a career in pharmaceutical industry in Japan. His war crimes were kept secret for many years, and it was not until the 1980s that the information from Unit 731 and Ishii's actions came to light. Ishii died in 1959. Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was a wealthy American financier and convicted sex offender who is known for his connections to prominent political, businessmen, and celebrities. Epstein's life and actions were subject to extensive controversy and scrutiny due to his involvement in illegal and unethical activities, particularly related to sexual exploitation and trafficking of minors. Epstein's early career involved working in finance and investment banking, and he gained considerable wealth through his business dealings. However, his criminal activity came to light in the mid-2000s when he was accused of sexually abusing underage girls. In 2008, he pled guilty to state charges of soliciting a minor for prostitution and was sentenced to 18 months in prison. He also registered as a sex offender at this time. Due to the short length of his imprisonment, many people began to question if his wealth and connections aided in him having a shorter prison sentence. Over the years, he developed relationships with numerous high-profile individuals, including former U.S. President Bill Clinton, former U.S. President Donald Trump, British Prince Andrew, and the list goes on. In July 2019, Epstein was arrested again on federal charges of sex trafficking on minors and took his own life in his jail cell a month later. Suspicion and conspiracy theories due to the circumstances surrounding it, leading to ongoing investigations and legal proceedings involving his associates. Ted Kaczynski. Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, is an American domestic terrorist who carried out a series of bombings in the United States between 1978 and 1995. Kaczynski's bombings targeted universities, airlines, and technology companies and resulted in the deaths of 3 people and numerous injuries. His attacks were motivated by his extreme anti-technology and anti-industrial beliefs. which he outlined in a manifesto titled Industrial Society and Its Future, also known as the Unabomber Manifesto. In this manifesto, Kaczynski argued against the perceived negative impacts of modern technology and industrialization on society and called for a return to a primitive and nature-centric way of life. Kaczynski's bombings generated widespread fear and panic, and he eluded capture for many years. However, in 1995, his brother recognized his writing style in the manifesto and tipped off the authorities, leading to his arrest. In 1998, Kaczynski pled guilty to multiple federal charges, including bombing and murder, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gary Ridgway. Ridgway is an American serial killer who was convicted of murdering at least 49 women in the Seattle, Washington area during the 1980s and 1990s. He targeted vulnerable women, many of whom were involved in prostitution or had a history of drug addiction, lured them into his truck before sexually assaulting and strangling them. He would often dump their bodies in remote areas, primarily in the Green River area near Seattle, which gave him the nickname Green River Killer. He was able to avoid detection due to his ability to blend in and his careful disposal of evidence. However, in 2001, advances in DNA technology led to his arrest when his DNA was matched to evidence found on some of the victims. In a plea bargain, Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder and agreed to provide information on his victims in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Delphine LaLaurie. LaLaurie was a slave owner in New Orleans during the 19th century and was known for her cruelty towards her slaves and was said to have tortured and mutilated them in her mansion. Her atrocities came to light in 1834 when a fire broke out in her home and firefighters discovered slaves chained in the attic who showed signs of severe abuse. After the discovery of the tortured slaves, an angry mob descended upon her mansion and she and her husband fled to France. Her whereabouts after fleeing New Orleans are unclear and it is unknown if she ever faced any legal consequences for her crimes. Thomas Thistlewood. Thistlewood was a plantation owner and slave master who kept meticulous records of his daily activities, including the brutal treatment of his slaves. His diaries, which span over 37 years, provide a disturbing insight into the life of a slave master and the horrific conditions endured by slaves on a Jamaican plantation. Thistlewood's diaries reveal that he regularly raped his female slaves and inflicted severe punishments, including flogging, mutilation, and even murder, for the smallest infractions. He was known for his involvement in the slave trade, buying and selling slaves for profit. Thistlewood died in 1786, and his diaries were discovered in the early 20th century. They have since been studied by historians and are considered a valuable resource of information on slavery in the Caribbean during the 18th century. Stephen Paddock. Paddock was an American mass murderer who carried out the deadliest mass shooting in modern American history. On October 1st, 2017, Paddock opened fire on a group of concert-goers from the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada. He killed over 60 people and injured more than 800 others before taking his own life. The attack lasted approximately 10 minutes. In the aftermath of the shooting, investigators discovered that Paddock had meticulously planned the attack, amassing a large arsenal of weapons and ammunition in his hotel room. He also had an extensive knowledge of firearms and had used bump stocks to modify his semi-automatic rifles into fully automatic weapons. Paddock's motive for the shooting remains unclear. He had no known criminal history or extremist affiliations, and no evidence has been found to suggest a specific motive for his actions. Charles Whitman. Whitman is an American mass murderer who is known for carrying out a shooting spree at the University of Texas at Austin on August 1st, 1966. Whitman climbed to the top of the school's clock tower and opened fire on passersby, killing 14 people and injuring dozens more. Prior to the shooting, Whitman had also killed his mother and wife. Whitman's rampage lasted for 96 minutes before he was finally shot and killed by police officers who had climbed the tower to confront him. His case is notable for being one of the first mass shootings in modern American history and for bringing attention to the issue of gun control. This could be unrelated, but Whitman's brain was later studied and found to have a tumor that may have contributed to his violent behavior. However, that's not confirmed. John Venables and Robert Thompson. Venables and Thompson were convicted of murdering 2-year-old James Bulger in 1993. At the time of the crime, Venables and Thompson were both 10 years old, making them some of the youngest murderers in modern British history. The two boys abducted James from a shopping center in Liverpool, England, and then took him on a 6-kilometer journey through the city, during which they beat him with bricks, iron bars, and sexually assaulted him, and eventually left him on the train tracks to be hit by a train. Venables and Thompson were arrested and charged with James's murder, and after a trial in November 1993, they were both found guilty and detained indefinitely. They were both released on parole in 2001, but Venables was later returned to prison after violating the terms of his release. In 2010, both Venables and Thompson were both given new identities and relocated under a court order to protect them from public retribution, which, I mean, come on, they kind of deserve it. Timothy McVeigh. McVeigh was a domestic terrorist who orchestrated the Oklahoma City bombings on April 19, 1995, which killed 168 people and injured hundreds more. McVeigh was a former U.S. Army soldier who was motivated by his extreme anti-government beliefs and opposition to federal law enforcement actions. McVeigh planned the bombing for months, and he and his accomplice, Terry Nichols, built a bomb out of fertilizer and other materials. The two parked a rental truck loaded with the bomb in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City and detonated. McVeigh was arrested and eventually convicted of 11 federal offenses, including conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and was sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection on June 11, 2001. Victor Salva. Salva is an American film director and convicted sex offender who was convicted in 1988 of sexually abusing the lead actor during the production of his film Clown House, who was 12 years old at the time. He served 15 months in prison and was released on parole in 1992. Despite the controversy surrounding his past, Salva continued to work in Hollywood and directed several well-known films, including the horror movie Jeepers Creepers and its sequels. However, his past crimes have continued to be a source of controversy and criticism. Salva's case has brought attention to the issue of convicted sex offenders in the entertainment industry and the responsibility of studios, producers, and movie cast members to ensure the safety of child actors. Casey Anthony. Anthony is an American woman who was the defendant in a high-profile murder trial in 2011. She was accused of murdering her 2-year-old daughter, Kaylee Anthony, in 2008. Kaylee was reported missing by her grandmother, and her remains were found 6 months later in a wooded area near the family's home. Casey initially told the police that a babysitter had kidnapped Kaylee, but later changed her story multiple times. She was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and other crimes. The prosecution argued that Casey had killed Kaylee so she could live a party lifestyle without the responsibilities of a motherhood. During the trial, the defense argued that Kaylee had drowned accidentally in the family's swimming pool and that Casey panicked and covered up the death. In July 2011, Casey was found not guilty of all charges related to Kaylee's death, except for 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The verdict was controversial, with some people believing that Casey had gotten away with murder, while others believed that the prosecution had failed to prove her case beyond a reasonable doubt. Diane Downs. On the night of May 19, 1983, Downs shot her 3 children, 8-year-old Christine, 7-year-old Cheryl, and 3-year-old Danny, while driving them to an hospital, claiming that a stranger had attempted to carjack her and shot the children. Christy survived the attack, but Cheryl died from her injuries and Danny was left paralyzed. The investigation into the shooting uncovered evidence that suggested that Downs had staged the attack in an attempt to kill their children, possibly as a way to win back a former lover who did not want children. Downs was eventually arrested and charged with murder and attempted murder. In 1984, Downs was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. She continues to maintain her innocence and has had multiple attempts to appeal her conviction. Tsutomu Miyazaki. Miyazaki, also known as the Otaku Murderer, was a Japanese serial killer who killed 4 young girls in Tokyo between 1988 and 1989. In his early 20s, Miyazaki became obsessed with hentai and video games, which he believed were his only sources of comfort and happiness. His obsession with anime and his distorted views of sexuality led him to commit heinous crimes against young women. Miyazaki's first victim was a 4-year-old girl whom he abducted and killed. As he continued to kill 3 more girls, all of them were under the age of 7, before he was finally caught in 1989. Miyazaki was convicted of his crimes and was sentenced to death. During his trial, it was revealed that Miyazaki had kept the remains of his victims, including their hands and heads, as souvenirs. He also sent letters to the families of the victims taunting them about their daughters' deaths. Omar Mateen. Mateen was an American man who carried out a mass shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida on June 12, 2016. The attack resulted in the death of 49 people and injured 53 others. During the attack, Mateen pledged allegiance to the Islamic State and expressed anti-gay sentiments. The incident is widely condemned as an act of terrorism and a hate crime against the LGBTQ community. Dylan Roof. Roof is an American man who carried out a mass shooting at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina on June 17, 2015. The attack resulted in the death of 9 people and he injured 1 other. After the shooting, Roof fled the scene and was later apprehended and charged with numerous federal and state crimes, including hate crimes, obstruction of religion, and firearm offenses. He was found guilty on all charges and was sentenced to death. Roof, a self-identified white supremacist, had posted racist and anti-Semitic messages online prior to the shooting. He specifically targeted the historically black church in an attempt to incite a race war. Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas was an American serial killer who confessed to murdering over 600 people during the 1970s and 80s. Lucas was convicted of murdering 11 people, but he claimed responsibility for many more. However, many of his confessions were later determined to be false. Despite the inconsistencies in his confessions, Lucas is still considered to be one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Lucas had a troubled upbringing and was reportedly abused by his mother. He began committing crimes at a young age and spent most of his life in and out of prison. He was ultimately sentenced to death in Texas for the murder of an identified woman, but his sentence was later commuted to life in prison by Governor George W. Bush in 1998. Lucas died in prison on March 13, 2001 at the age of 64. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. Bernardo and Homolka are a Canadian couple who were convicted of multiple crimes in the 1990s. Between 1990 and 1992, Bernardo and Homolka committed a series of heinous crimes, including kidnapping, rape, and murder of 3 young girls, including Homolka's younger sister, Tammy. The couple videotaped themselves committing these crimes, which became known as the Ken and Barbie murders, due to their perceived attractiveness and seeming normalcy. In 1993, Homolka struck a plea deal with prosecutors, pleading guilty to manslaughter manslaughter and testifying against Bernardo in exchange for a reduced sentence. Bernardo was subsequently found guilty of multiple charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ian Brady and Maura Hindley. Brady and Hindley were a British couple who were convicted of multiple murders in the 1960s. They were commonly referred to as the Moors murderers due to the location of where they buried their victims, the Saddleworth Moor in Greater Manchester, England. Between 1963 and 1965, Brady and Hindley targeted young children and teenagers. They would lure their victims into their cars before sexually assaulting and killing them. In 1966, Brady was found guilty on 3 counts of murder, while Hindley was found guilty of 2 counts of murder and a accessory charge. They were both sentenced to life in prison. Brady died in prison on May 15, 2017, and Hindley died in prison on November 15, 2002. Josh Duggar. Duggar is an American television personality who gained fame as part of the reality TV show 19 Kids and Counting, which aired on TLC from 2008 to 2015. In May 2015, it was revealed that Josh had sexually molested several underage girls, including some of his sisters. He publicly apologized for his actions and resigned from his position as executive director of the Family Research Council, which is a conservative lobbying group. The scandal led to the cancellation of the show 19 Kids and Counting later that year. In November 2015, Josh admitted to cheating on his wife Anna and having a pornography addiction. He entered a long-term faith-based rehabilitation program and has since been working to rebuild his marriage and family life. In 2019, Josh was arrested on charges of possession of child pornography. He was accused of downloading and possessing explicit images of minors, some of which were as young as 5 years old. In April 2021, he was arrested again on similar charges and is currently awaiting trial. Jodi Arias. Arias is an American woman who gained national attention for the brutal murder of her ex-boyfriend Travis Alexander on June 4, 2008. Alexander was found dead in his home in Mesa, Arizona with multiple stab wounds, a slit throat, and a gunshot wound to the head. Arias was quickly identified as the suspect and eventually arrested for his murder. During her highly publicized trial, Arias initially denied any involvement in the crime but later claimed that she killed Alexander in self-defense. She alleged that he had physically and emotionally abused her during their relationship. In May 2013, Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case continued to receive media attention due to the salacious details and the conflicting accounts of what actually happened on the night of the murder. In April 2015, Arias was granted a retrial on the penalty phase of her sentence after the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision on whether to sentence her to death or life in prison. In April 2018, a judge ruled that Arias will spend the rest of her life in prison without the possibility of parole. Israel Keyes. Keyes was an American serial killer who admitted to killing at least 11 people between 2001 and 2012. Keyes was known for his meticulous planning and his ability to avoid detection by law enforcement. He often traveled long distances to randomly select his victims, and he would bury his kill kits containing weapons, cash, and other items in remote locations to use in future crimes. Keyes was caught in 2012 after he was linked to the abduction and murder of 18-year-old Samantha Koenig in Anchorage, Alaska. Keyes had abducted Koenig from a coffee stand where she worked and then held her captive for several weeks before killing her. Keyes was eventually caught because he used Koenig's debit card to withdraw money from an ATM. During his interrogation, Keyes admitted to several other murders and provided details about his crimes, including the locations of his kill kits. Keyes committed suicide in jail in December of 2012 before he could be brought to trial for his crimes. The full extent of his crimes and the identities of all of his victims may never be known. Mr. Cruel is the nickname given to an unidentified Australian serial rapist and murderer who committed a string of crimes in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Mr. Cruel is believed to have been responsible for at least 4 attacks in Melbourne, Australia between 1987 and 1991, where he would break into homes, usually at night, and would tie up and sexually assault his victims, who were often children. In some cases, he would keep his victims for several days before releasing them. Despite an extensive investigation and manhunt, Mr. Cruel has never been caught. Gertrude Benesquetsky. Benesquetsky was an American woman who gained notoriety for the torture and murder of Sylvia Likens, a 16-year-old girl who was under her care. In 1965, Sylvia and her sister Jenny were left in the care of Benesquetsky and her children while her parents traveled with a carnival. Benesquetsky and her children subjected Sylvia to months of physical and emotional abuse, including burning her with cigarettes, branding her, and forcing her to eat feces and urine. On October 26, 1965, Sylvia died from her injuries. Her body was found covered in bruises, burns, and the words, "I am a prostitute and proud of it," carved into her stomach. Benesquetsky, her children, and several neighborhood children were arrested and charged with murder. Benesquetsky was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. However, she was eventually paroled in 1985 and lived under an assumed name until her death in 1990. Lauren Southern. Southern is a Canadian political activist, author, and journalist who is known for her far-right views and controversial statements on topics such as immigration, feminism, and Islam. Southern first gained notoriety in 2015 as a contributor to the Rebel Media, a Canadian conservative news outlet. She later left the Rebel and became an independent journalist producing videos, documentaries on topics such as the European migration crisis and white Southern African farmers. Southern has been accused of promoting white nationalist and alt-right ideologies and has been associated with far-right figures such as Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos. She has also been criticized criticized for her anti-feminist views, including her opposition to abortion and her support to traditional gender roles. In 2018, Southern was denied entry to the UK after the government deemed her presence in the country not conducive to the public good. She had planned to interview Tommy Richards, a far-right activist who had been jailed for contempt of court. Southern has authored 2 books, Barbarians, How Baby Boomers, Immigrants, and Islam Screwed My Generation, and The Borderless World, Power and Strategy in the Interlinked Economy. Alec Minassian. Minassian is a Canadian man who carried out a vehicular attack in Toronto, Canada on April 23, 2018 that killed 10 people and injured 16 others. Minassian rented a van and drove it into pedestrians on a busy street in Toronto, targeting women in particular. He was arrested shortly after the attack and charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder and 16 counts of attempted murder. During his trial, Minassian claimed to be part of an online community of men who felt frustrated and angry over their inability to attract women romantically. He described his actions as a form of revenge against society for his perceived social isolation and rejection. In March 2021, Minassian was found guilty on all 26 charges and was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Catherine Knight. Knight is an Australian woman who was convicted of the murder of her partner, John Price. Knight and Price had a tumultuous and violent relationship, and in 2000, Price took out a restraining order against Knight. However, the order did not prevent Knight from entering Price's home on February 29, 2000, where she stabbed him multiple times and then skinned him. Knight then cooked Price's skin with the intention of serving it to his children. She also decapitated Price's head and hung it on a meat hook in the living room. Knight was arrested and charged with murder, and during her trial, it was revealed that she had a history of violence and had previously stabbed and killed a pet dog. She was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her case is also notable for being the first woman in Australia to serve a life sentence in prison without parole. Andrei Chikatilo. Chikatilo, also known as the Butcher of Rostov, was a Soviet serial killer who was convicted of murdering at least 52 women and children between 1978 and 1990. Chikatilo was a former teacher who preyed on young women and children in the Rostov Oblast of the Soviet Union. He would often lure his victims to secluded areas where he would rape and kill them. Chikatilo also was known for mutilating his victims' bodies and was said to have eaten some of their flesh. Chikatilo was eventually caught in 1990 after DNA evidence linked him to the murders. He was convicted of 52 of the murders in 1992 and was sentenced to death. He was executed by firing squad on February 14, 1994. Lawrence Bittaker. Bittaker was an American serial killer who was convicted of kidnapping, torturing, and murdering 5 teenage girls in California in 1979. Bittaker and his accomplice, Roy Norris, targeted young women and would often offer them rides in their van. Once the women were inside, they would subject them to hours of torture, rape, and ultimately murder. Bittaker recorded the sounds of his victims' screams and cries for help on audio tapes. Bittaker was eventually caught in 1980 when a woman who had escaped from their van had reported them to the police. Norris was arrested shortly after, and both men were charged with murder. Bittaker was found guilty on 5 counts of murder and was sentenced to death. Norris had a plea deal and was sentenced to life in prison. However, Bittaker died in prison on December 13, 2019, while awaiting execution. Nathan Larson. Larson is an American white supremacist, pedophile, and convicted felon who gained notoriety for his controversial views and disturbing online activities. Larson has been linked to multiple extremist groups and has expressed support for various far-right and white nationalist causes. He's also openly admitted to being a pedophile, claiming that he believes it should be illegal for adults to have sex with children. In addition to his extremist beliefs, Larson has a history of criminal activity, including charges of threatening to kill the President of the United States in possession of child pornography. In 2018, Larson ran as an independent candidate for Congress in Virginia's 10th district, but his campaign was widely condemned and he ultimately withdrew. He was later arrested in December of that year for allegedly kidnapping a 12-year-old girl and taking her across state lines. Larson was convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 40 years in prison in 2021. Marcus Wesson. Wesson is an American man who was convicted of 9 counts of first-degree murder in 2004, slaying 9 of his children, whom he had fathered with his own daughters and nieces. Wesson's crimes came to light on March 12, 2004, when police responded to a call from a woman who had claimed she had escaped from Wesson's home, where she and her sisters had been held captive for years. When police arrived, they found the bodies of Wesson's children, ranging in age from 1 to 25, stacked on top of each other in a bedroom. They had found Wesson inside the home armed with a handgun and surrounded by his dead children. Wesson was arrested and charged with 9 counts of first-degree murder. During the trial, he had claimed that his children had all taken their lives in a suicide pact. However, the jury rejected the defense and convicted him of all charges. In 2005, he was sentenced to death. John Justin Bunting. Bunting was the ringleader of a group of killers known as the Snowtown Murderers. He and his accomplices, involving his lover Robert Wagner, targeted people they believed to be pedophiles, homosexuals, and drug addicts. They would lower their victims to a home in the Adelaide suburb of Snowtown, where they would torture and kill them. The bodies were then dismembered, placed in barrels, and stored in a disused bank vault. Bunting's murders took place over the period of 1992 to 1999. The killings were discovered in 1999 when police found the barrels containing the remains of the victims. Bunting and his accomplices were arrested and charged with the murders. During his trial, Bunting showed no remorse for his actions and reportedly enjoyed the attention he received from the media. He was convicted of 11 counts of murder murder in 2003 and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Leonard Lake. Lake was an American serial killer who, along with his accomplice Charles N., was responsible for the torture and murder of an unknown number of victims in the 1980s. Lake and N. met while serving in the Marines and developed a shared interest in firearms, survivalism, and torture. They began abducting and killing women and children, often taking photographs and videotaping their victims' suffering. Lake also had a self-built bunker in the Sierra Nevada mountains where he had planned to create a sex slave farm and preserve his own DNA through incestuous reproduction. Lake was arrested in 1985 on a weapons charge, and police discovered evidence of his and N's crimes while searching his property. Lake committed suicide by cyanide poisoning while in police custody, and N was later apprehended in Canada and extradited to the United States, where he was convicted of 11 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Rodney Alcala. Alcala, also known as the dating game killer, was an American serial killer who was active in the 1960s and 70s. Alcala's criminal history began in the late 1960s when he was arrested for the rape and attempted murder of an 8-year-old girl. He was convicted and sentenced to prison but was released on parole after only 34 months. He continued to commit crimes, including the murder of at least 8 women, some of whom he had met on the popular TV show The Dating Game in 1978. Alcala was known for his good looks and charisma, which he had used to lure women into his trap. He would often take pictures of his victims before killing them, and some of those pictures were found in his possession when he was arrested in 1979. After a lengthy trial, he was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder in 1980 and was sentenced to death. Alcala's case received renewed attention in the 2000s when DNA evidence linked him to several unsolved murders. In 2010, he was convicted of 2 additional murders and sentenced to death again. He continued to maintain his innocence and appeal his convictions until his death in 2021. Anatoly Slivko. Slivko was the Soviet serial killer who was active between 1964 and 1985. Born in the Soviet Union, Slivko was a former military officer and a well-known sports instructor who had received various awards for his work in organizing youth programs. Behind his public image, Slivko had a dark secret. He had a fascination with hanging and would often conduct experiments on himself and others to learn the effects of asphyxiation. In 1964, he took his obsession to the next level by luring a teenage boy to a remote location where he hanged him and then sexually assaulted his corpse. Over the years, Slivko continued to lure teenage boys to remote areas where he would hang them and then engage in sexual acts with the bodies. He would also videotape the murders and use the footage to relive the crimes later on. Slivko's crimes went undetected for years, but in 1985, a boy he had tried to abduct managed to escape and alerted the authorities. When police searched Slivko's home, they found evidence of his crimes, including the videotapes of the victims' murders. Slivko was convicted of 7 counts of murder and sentenced to death. He was executed by firing squad on September 16, 1989. China P. Arnold. Arnold is an American woman who was convicted of murdering her infant daughter, Paris Talley, in 2005. On August 22, 2005, Arnold became involved in an argument with her boyfriend, Terrell Talley, over the paternity of their 28-day-old daughter, Paris. During the argument, Arnold allegedly grabbed the baby by the leg and slammed her against a hard surface, causing fatal injuries. Arnold initially claimed that the baby had been kidnapped, but later admitted to the murder. She was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, and in 2008 was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The case also raised questions about the mental state of the defendant, as Arnold had a history of mental illness and had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder, or BPD. Philip Carl Jablonski. Jablonski was an American serial killer who was active in the 1970s and 80s. Jablonski's first known murder was in 1978 when he killed his first wife, Carol Spadoni, and her mother, Eva Peterson, in California. He was convicted of these murders and was sentenced to death, but his sentence was later commuted to life in prison without parole. While in prison, Jablonski continued to exhibit violent behaviors and was eventually linked to 3 more murders committed between 1982 and 1991. These murders include the killing of a girlfriend, a former prison pen pal, and a woman he had met through a dating service. In 1994, Jablonski was tried and convicted for these additional murders, and he was sentenced to death. He spent the next 17 years appealing his sentence and attempting to have his death sentence overturned, but he was ultimately executed by lethal injection in 2012. David Vanity. Vanity, whose real name is Jesus David Torres, is an American musician and singer who is the frontman of an electro-pop band, Blood on the Dance Floor. Vanity has been accused of multiple allegations of sexual assault, grooming, and pedophilia involving underage fans and aspiring musicians who were looking for opportunities to work with him. Some of the victims have alleged that Vanity would ply them with drugs and alcohol and would groom them on social media. In 2018, a former Blood on the Dance Floor member, Jay Vaughn Monroe, publicly accused Vanity of sexual misconduct and abuse. Following the allegations, Vanity was dropped by his record label and banned from performing at several venues. In 2020, Vanity was arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault and child pornography-related offenses. The case is ongoing, but Vanity has maintained his innocence. Bevan Spencer Von Enim. Spencer is an Australian convicted murderer and suspected serial killer. He was convicted of the 1979 murder of 15-year-old Richard Kelvin Kelvin, a crime that shocked Australia due to its brutality and Von Imes' wealthy and well-connected family. Spencer was known for his interest in young boys and was suspected in a series of other unsolved murders and disappearances of young men in the Adelaide area. The victims all had connections to Spencer and his associates, however their bodies were never found. Spencer was a rumored homosexual and the murders were believed to possibly be sexually motivated. He was also rumored to have connections to a pedophilia ring operation in the area, however none of these allegations have been confirmed. In 1984, Spencer was convicted of Kelvin's murder and sentenced to life in prison. He has maintained his innocence and continues to appeal his conviction. However, evidence presented at the trial, including DNA evidence and testimonies from witnesses who claim to have seen Spencer with Kelvin on the night of the murder. Donald Smith. Smith was a convicted child sexual offender who kidnapped, raped, and murdered 8-year-old Cherish Periwinkle in 2013 in Jacksonville, Florida. Smith had a long history of sexual offenses against children, including a 1993 conviction for an attempted kidnapping and a 2009 conviction for possession of child pornography. Despite his criminal record, he was released from prison and placed on probation. On June 21st, 2013, Smith abducted Cherish from a Walmart in Jacksonville. He lured her away from her mother by offering to buy her clothes and food. He then took her to a secluded area where he raped and murdered her. Following an extensive search, police arrested Smith and charged him with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery against a child. He was found guilty on all charges in 2018 and was sentenced to death. The case sparked outrage and led to changes in Florida's laws surrounding the release and monitoring of convicted sex offenders. Cherish's law, named after the victim, required a mandatory life sentence for those convicted of sexual battery of a child under the age of 12. Ken McElroy. McElroy was a notorious criminal and bully who terrorized the town of Skidmore, Missouri for years. He was suspected of committing numerous crimes, including theft, arson, assault, and rape. Despite numerous arrests, he managed to evade convictions due to witness intimidation and other tactics. On July 10th, 1981, McElroy was shot to death in the main street of Skidmore. The killing took place in front of dozens of witnesses, but no one was willing to come forward to identify the shooter. The case remains unsolved to this day, and theories about who was responsible range from vigilantes seeking justice for McElroy's victims to law enforcement officials who have turned a blind eye to his crimes. Anthony Powell. Powell is an Australian man who was convicted of the brutal murder of his girlfriend Caroline Byrne. Byrne was found dead at the bottom of a cliff in Sydney in 1995, and her death was initially ruled as a suicide. However, her family and her friends were convinced that she had been murdered and they had pushed for the case to be reopened. In 2006, a new investigation was launched and Powell was charged with Byrne's murder. The prosecution argued that Powell had killed Byrne because she was planning to leave him and he could not handle the rejection. They presented evidence that Powell had been physically and emotionally abusive towards Byrne and that he had threatened to kill her in the past. At trial, Powell claimed he was innocent and that Byrne had killed herself. However, the jury ultimately found him guilty of the murder and he was sentenced to life in prison. Keemstar. Daniel Keem is an American YouTuber and internet personality. He first gained fame as the host of the YouTube drama news show Drama Alert, where he reports on and comments on controversial events and disputes between other YouTubers. Keemstar has been involved in several controversies himself, including allegations of harassment and cyberbullying towards other YouTubers and fans. He's also been criticized for his coverage of sensitive topics and for sensationalizing news stories for clicks and views. In 2016, Keemstar was criticized for his role in promoting false allegations of pedophilia against the 62-year-old YouTube streamer, which led to the man being doxxed and harassed. Keemstar later apologized for his involvement in these situations. Despite the controversies, Keemstar remains a popular figure on YouTube with over 5 million subscribers on his Drama Alert channel. Javed Iqbal. Iqbal was a Pakistani serial killer who confessed to the rape, torture, and murder of 100 boys, ranging in the age of 6 to 16 years old in Lahore, Pakistan between 1998 and 1999. Iqbal was a wealthy businessman who had used his position and money to lure young boys into his house where he would sexually abuse and torture them before killing them. He would then dispose of their bodies by dissolving them in acid, often sending letters to the families of his victims detailing what he had done and where he had disposed of the remains. After being arrested in December 1999, Iqbal confessed to his crimes and claimed that he had committed them as a way of getting revenge on society for his own abuse and mistreatment as a child. He was found guilty of the murders and sentenced to death by hanging in 2000. Pedro Lopez. Lopez, also known as the Monster of the Andes, is a Colombian serial killer who is believed to have killed over 300 young girls across South America during the 1970s. Lopez began his killings in his early 20s, where he would lure young girls, usually between the ages of 8 and 12, away from their families with the promise of gifts and money. He would often rape and kill them, sometimes leaving their bodies in shallow graves or throwing them into rivers. Lopez was arrested in Ecuador in 1980 after attempting to abduct a young girl. He confessed to murdering over 300 girls and led authorities to many of their bodies. He was found guilty on killing 110 girls in Ecuador and sentenced to life in prison. However, he was later extradited to Colombia and convicted of killing kidnapping 3 more girls, but was released in 1998 due to a law that set a maximum sentence of 30 years. Lopez's current whereabouts are unknown, but he is believed to be living in Peru under a new identity. Isabella Loretta Jank. Jank is a former Trump administration official and a conservative activist who was arrested in May 2021 on charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping and other related crimes. The charges stem from alleged plot to kidnap the 8-year-old son of Jank's former boyfriend, Dr. Mark Rettenmaier, in an attempt to gain leverage in a custody battle. Jank was a former staffer for the Trump administration's Department of Health and Human Services, where she worked on a project related to COVID-19 testing. Prior to her time in government, Jank was involved in various conservative causes and was a frequent contributor to conservative media outlets. According to prosecutors, Jank conspired with her mother, father, and a man named Eric Isozaki to carry out a kidnapping plot. Jank and Isozaki allegedly surveilled Rittenmeier's home and his son's school and planned to use a rented van to abduct the child. The plot was ultimately fooled by law enforcement, and Jank was arrested along with her co-conspirators. Jank has pled not guilty to the charges against her, and her case is currently pending in federal court. Josh Moon. Moon, also known as Null, is an American blogger and internet personality who founded the website Kiwi Farms. The website, which builds itself as a forum for discussing internet culture, has been criticized for enabling online harassment and doxing. Moon has also been accused of promoting far-right and white supremacist ideologies on the website. In 2019, Kiwi Farms was linked to the mass shooting of a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, as the shooter had posted a manifesto on the site prior to the attack. Moon was faced with numerous legal challenges relating to Kiwi Farms, including lawsuits for defamation and stalking. Marciano Milan Vasquez. Vasquez was a Mexican drug lord who was the leader of the Milan drug cartel based in the state of Michoacan. He gained notoriety for his involvement in the Mexican drug war, which saw a wave of violence and bloodshed throughout the country. Vasquez and his cartel were involved in a wide range of criminal activities, including drug trafficking, kidnapping, extortion, and murder. In 2011, Vasquez was arrested by Mexican authorities and charged with a number of crimes involving drug trafficking and money laundering. He was extradited to the United States in 2015 and pleaded guilty to several charges relating to drug trafficking and racketeering. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in 2017. Carl Harold. Harold was a mathematician and computer programmer from Canada. He was known for his YouTube account where he published videos of computer graphics and program language design. He also gained notoriety for his involvement in the creation of the website The Best Page in the Universe, where he posted controversial and often offensive content. In 2013, Carl and his romantic partner Charles Denavant were arrested and charged with making child pornography of Carl's own son and many other pedophile-related crimes. He locked up his son in his basement and started to sexually abuse him and post videos of it online. He also prevented his son from going outside or going to school and had threatened to kill him if he had told anyone about the abuse. Because of this incident, he was judged and incarcerated for sodomy, sexual abuse, aggravated child abuse, child pornography production, and distributing child pornography. He and Donavant's bails were set to $1 billion. In 2014, he was found hanging himself in his Alabama jail cell, having killed himself to avoid the trial and sentencing. His co-conspirator Charles was sentenced to 56 years in prison for his part in the abuse. Jason Ether. Ether, who goes by the name J Station, is a Canadian YouTube personality who gained notoriety for his controversial and often insensitive videos. These videos included a 3 a.m. challenge, a Ouija board challenge of recently deceased celebrities, and visiting the suicide forest. He has been accused of staging most of his paranormal activity on his channel, his pranks, and also has been criticized for inappropriate behavior towards women. In 2020, he was arrested and charged with an assault and domestic violence against his girlfriend. In 2021, his YouTube account had been terminated due to continuous violations against YouTube's TOS. Matthew Falder. Falder was a British academic and a convicted sex offender who was arrested in 2017 for committing numerous offenses, including encouraging the rape and torture of children, sharing indecent images of children, and blackmailing his victims. Falder was a graduate student from Cambridge University, and he had used his position to target vulnerable individuals whom he could manipulate and exploit. He was often found to have created and operated several dark web forums where he shared and traded child sexual abuse material, and he had also had a network of individuals who helped carry out his activities. In 2018, Faldex was sentenced to 32 years in prison, one of the longest sentences ever handed down for sexual offenses in the UK. Dion Eason. EDP445 is a YouTube personality who became popular for his commentary on sports and video games. However, he was involved in a controversy due to allegations of inappropriate behaviors towards minors. In 2021, a sting operation was conducted by a group called Predator Poachers, claimed that Eason had been engaged engaged in sexually explicit conversations with the 13-year-old girl. The group had released a video of their interactions with Eason and alleged that he had plans to meet with the girl in person. The videos went viral on social media and led to widespread condemnation of EDP. However, he continued to deny the allegations and claimed that he had been set up. However, evidence later emerged that seemed to corroborate the claims made by predator poachers. As a result, EDP was banned from YouTube and has faced criticism and backlash from his fans in the wider online community. The legal case against him is still ongoing. Michelle Carter. Carter is an American woman who gained notoriety for her involvement in the suicide of Conrad Roy III in 2014. Carter and Roy had met each other online in 2012 and had an on-off relationship through text and social media. Roy had a history of depression and suicidal thoughts and had attempted suicide in the past. On July 12, 2014, Roy parked his truck in a Kmart parking lot and began filling it with carbon monoxide from a generator he had brought with him. He had texted Carter about his plan and she encouraged him to go through with it, even when he became hesitant. After Roy's death, investigators found numerous texts between Carter and Roy in which she had urged him to kill himself, even suggesting ways he could do it. In 2014, Carter was charged with involuntary manslaughter and was found guilty by a judge in 2019. She was sentenced to 15 months in prison, but her sentence was stayed while she appealed. In 2020, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court upheld her conviction and she began serving her sentence. She was released from prison in January of 2021 after serving about 11 months. Nathaniel Barr Jonah. Jonah was an American convicted serial killer and cannibal. He was born in Worcester, Massachusetts, and had a criminal history from an early age. Jonah was convicted of sexually assaulting 2 boys in Montana in 1977 and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. After his release, he moved to Massachusetts and worked as a chef. Between 1991 and 1999, Jonah kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered at least 1 child and possibly up to 10 in the Worcester area. He's known to have tortured and cannibalized his victims, and some of their remains were found in his apartment. Jonah was arrested in 1999 and charged with the murder of 10-year-old Zachary Ramsey. He was found guilty in 2001 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 2004, Jonah was charged with the kidnapping and murder of a 13-year-old Christopher Mayer in Montana in 1974. However, he died in prison before he could be tried for this crime. And that is the Worst People Iceberg. If you stuck around this long, I'd like to say thank you. I really wish I could pump these out much sooner for you guys. It's been about 7 months since my last video upload. Once again, thank you very, very much. This is Sleepy, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.